Hey guys, tonight we set out on an unexpected journey, where the soft crunch of sand underfoot stretches endlessly in every direction, and the stars above are sharper than any you've ever seen. Somewhere, lost in this vast landscape, a camel stumbles, not gracefully, and what should have been a minor accident ripples through centuries of history. You're about to follow the not-so-sober footsteps that, according to a half-forgotten tale, nudged the Silk Roads into a new shape. Of course, you probably won't survive this trip if you were really walking it. Between the relentless desert, the sudden sandstorms, and the lurking bandits, let's just say your travel insurance wouldn't cover any of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dry, cracked surface of a caravan route that feels eternal, stretching from one horizon to the next. The air smells faintly of hot stone and camel sweat, but you're getting used to it, or at least pretending to. Tonight's story starts not with an emperor, a general, or even an ambitious merchant, but with a camel. A very special camel. Special not because of its pedigree or strength. No, this camel was legendary for being, let's say, unusually relaxed. As the legend whispers, somewhere between a remote oasis and a merchant outpost, this particular beast managed to get tipsy. How? Well, historians still argue whether it was fermented dates or an unfortunate mishap involving wine meant for trade. Now, you might be raising an eyebrow, because camels and alcohol aren't exactly the iconic duo of history. But you're trudging through a time and place where fermented goods were common on trade routes, not just for the traders but sometimes, it seems, for their animals too. No refrigeration meant that fruit or grain often soured into alcohol whether you wanted it to or not. Imagine the scene: a caravan, tired and dust-choked, pulls up near a watering hole. The merchants unload their goods, among them large clay jars of sweet, fermented date wine, a much-valued luxury in these parts. They aren't the first to relax a bit after a hard day's journey. Laughter rings out, fires are lit, and the camels are hobbled nearby. Except one camel. This camel finds the jars before the traders finish their celebrations. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's hunger. Maybe it's that camels are known to munch on nearly anything if you let them. It noses a jar, sniffs, and then drinks. And drinks. And drinks some more. Pretty soon, the beast that was supposed to carry precious silk and spices is weaving and swaying, kneeling and rising in the sand in a way that's both hilarious and horrifying if you happen to own the merchandise on its back. No one's laughing the next morning. The drunken camel has wandered well off the beaten track, staggering into dunes that were best left alone. More crucially, it has knocked over several others in its bumbling flight, a domino of confusion that breaks the caravan apart. When the traders finally reassemble, tired and half-lost, they realize something: the ground here isn't so bad. It's firmer, with more reliable water holes spaced at intervals. It's out of the way of known bandit trails. It's less rocky than their usual route, saving the camel's feet. A new path is tested, cautiously at first. Then, as word spreads, because word always spreads faster than any caravan, other traders begin shifting, nudging the great arteries of the Silk Road ever so slightly off their old course. Historians, ever the skeptics, still argue whether this story holds water. Did a drunken camel really reroute a trade network spanning from China to the Mediterranean? Or is this just a merchant's tall tale, exaggerated at the 100th retelling in a caravanserai's firelight? Still, the beauty of history isn't always in what's provably true, it's in what gets believed enough times that it reshapes the world anyway. Whether or not the drunken camel truly stumbled the Silk Roads onto a new path, the routes did change, and often for reasons far stranger than you'd expect. So as you adjust your saddle and squint into the sandy distance, you can't help but wonder, was it chance, stubborn geography, or a tipsy camel that decided the fate of countless traders to come? You tuck that thought into the dusty folds of your mind as you press forward, the caravan creaking and groaning beside you, the dunes whispering promises of stories yet untold. You shuffle onward, the dust from hundreds of hooves swirling around your ankles, and the vastness of the landscape seems to swallow sound itself. Still, the murmurs of traders, the groaning of laden camels, and the occasional bark of laughter from some private joke stitch a kind of music into the empty air. If you didn't know better, you might think the Silk Road was a single ribbon winding its elegant way across Asia, neatly plotted and predictably traveled. But of course, you do know better, or at least, you're about to. The Silk Road, despite the fancy name that sounds like something plucked straight out of a travel brochure, was anything but singular. It wasn't even really a road. Think less Roman highway and more choose-your-own-adventure book, but with extra sandstorms, fewer happy endings, and significantly worse directions. From China's bustling Tang capital of Chang'an to the merchant hubs of the Middle East and the sprawling cities of Europe, the Silk Road sprawled like a drunken spiderweb, crooked, shifting, endlessly reweaving itself. Depending on when you set out and how much you like to gamble with your own survival, there were multiple routes to pick from, each with its own challenges. Some hugged the edges of deserts like the Taklamakan or the Gobi, tiptoeing between oases. Others braved the high passes of the Pamir Mountains, where the air got so thin you could practically hear yourself wheeze. And as much as people loved silk, oh, they loved silk, but more on that later, they weren't about to fling themselves across the equivalent of the world's worst obstacle course without good reason. Historians still argue whether these routes evolved naturally, like water finding the easiest downhill path, or whether cunning merchants engineered them deliberately to outmaneuver rivals, dodge imperial taxes, or avoid ending up very decoratively impaled on the spears of local bandits. Here's a quirky fact to pack in your travel bag. Some caravan leaders use what can only be described as scouting pigeons. These birds, bred for endurance and trained to fly back to camp, were released if the caravan got dangerously lost or separated in a sandstorm. If you ever needed proof that business travel has always been stressful, there you go. Another fun tidbit: while silk gets top billing in the name, it wasn't even the most crucial item at various points. Sure, silk was luxurious, but depending on the century, you might just as easily encounter caravans groaning under the weight of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, spices from India, or even Buddhist texts, carefully wrapped and reverently carried. You glance at the merchant plodding beside you, his robes dusty, his turban slightly askew. He's not just ferrying goods, he's ferrying gossip, ideas, religions, entire ways of thinking. When historians wax poetic about the crossroads of civilizations, this is what they mean: a messy, chaotic, slightly smelling mingling of the world's best and worst. The Silk Roads didn't have an owner. Empires tried, oh, they tried, but the real boss of these routes was geography itself. Rivers flooded, dunes shifted, oases dried up or moved. Banditry and politics turned a safe passage into a death trap overnight. And, occasionally, a drunken camel would have its say, too. So when you picture this trade network, don't imagine a gleaming highway stretching from point A to point B. Imagine a living, breathing organism, always adapting, always on the move. Some routes thrived for centuries, others faded like footprints in the sand. And in that sprawling, chaotic web, even the smallest ripple, a new well dug, a town abandoned, a tipsy camel lurching off course, could redraw the lines that millions of lives depended on. You adjust your headscarf against the blowing grit, the taste of dust settling stubbornly on your tongue, and wonder how many of those ancient travelers ever realized how close to disaster and discovery they really walked. And you? You trudge on, following in the ghostly footprints of those who shaped the world without ever meaning to. Your boots grind into the sand as you cross another ridge, and from up here, the landscape unfolds like an unforgiving map, nothing but rust-colored dunes, cracked earth, and the occasional defiant shrub clinging to life. It's breathtaking, but not in a wish-you-were-here postcard way. More in a why did humans ever think this was a good idea way. Here's the thing about the Silk Roads that you don't get from the glossy museum displays: the geography was awful. Like, really awful. If Mother Nature had a do not disturb sign, these routes ignored it spectacularly. Every traveler who dared these paths had to wrestle with what can only be described as a bully's playground of natural hazards. Deserts like the Taklamakan, which, by the way, roughly translates to you can get in, but you won't get out, mocked you with false horizons and temperatures that swung wildly from boiling during the day to freezing at night. The Gobi Desert wasn't much friendlier, a rocky wasteland where the wind could strip skin off your face if you weren't careful. Then there were the mountains. The Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Hindu Kush, names that sound exotic and poetic until you're actually climbing them with lungs gasping for air, your breath frosting on your eyelashes. Avalanches, rock slides, and sheer exhaustion weren't inconveniences, they were constants. If the deserts didn't get you, the mountains would. Historians still argue whether merchants were brave or just plain desperate to push their way through such unfriendly terrain. The lure of profit certainly helped numb the danger, but sometimes necessity was the real driver. Empires rose and fell, cities boomed and busted, and traders had to adapt or die trying. And speaking of adapting, here's a quirky little fact. Some merchants resorted to carrying dried lizards in their packs, believing the charred remains brought luck against the evil spirits of the desert. You know, just in case dehydration and bandit attacks weren't bad enough, you also had to worry about ticked-off phantoms. The truth is, nobody wanted to march their goods across the roof of the world or the Great Sand Sea. They were pushed by forces larger than themselves, climate shifts, collapsing dynasties, drying oases. Sometimes, the only viable option was to carve a new path, no matter how risky or ridiculous it seemed. And so, like rivers carving new channels after a flood, the Silk Roads writhed and bucked against the landscape, adjusting with every generation. A once bustling trail could disappear in a decade if a water source dried up or a warlord set up a toll booth. You shade your eyes and squint at the horizon, where the ghostly outline of another caravan materializes, a blur of beige and brown, kicking up dust as it snakes its way toward an unseen destination. You wonder how many of them are new to this, still fresh enough to dream of riches waiting at the end of the journey. Most of them, you suspect, will settle for survival. As you plod forward, the ground shifts under your feet, a reminder that this world is always in motion. The very earth seems to conspire against permanence. And yet, somehow, against all odds, trade persisted. Goods moved. Ideas spread. People adapted. Even when camels got drunk and wandered, even when mountains collapsed and buried trails, even when bandits or emperors tried to shut it all down, the Silk Roads found a way. And so do you, step by dusty step, chasing a horizon that never seems to get any closer, but somehow, impossibly, is always just ahead. Your camel grunts under its breath, a sound somewhere between a groan and a complaint, as you shift in the saddle, feeling every bump and sway. If you thought riding a camel would be glamorous, something out of a painting, you're sorely mistaken. It's less noble caravan master and more unwilling participant in an ongoing core workout. Still, as awkward as you feel, you're riding the undisputed MVP of the Silk Roads. No creature was more crucial to the success, or the survival, of trade across these brutal landscapes than the humble, gloriously cantankerous camel. Historians still argue whether it was the domestication of the camel or the invention of the wheel that had a bigger impact on trade routes. Honestly, if you've ever seen a camel up close, you'd cast your vote for Team Camel, no question. These beasts are basically desert tanks. Their broad, padded feet act like snowshoes on sand. Their stomachs can hold more water than seems fair. And their famously bad temper? It's a feature, not a bug, makes them less likely to panic in a crisis. You, on the other hand, are already halfway to panic every time your camel shifts its weight. But it wasn't just about survival. Camels were cargo masters. One Bactrian camel, that's the two-humped, furrier model favored along the Silk Roads, could carry up to 500 pounds of goods. That's a lot of silk bolts, spices, or dried lizards for good luck. And here's a quirky little tidbit. Ancient traders developed a method called the camel string, where each camel was tied nose to tail to the one ahead. The result? A kind of living, swaying, slow-moving train that could stretch for miles. Merchants at the front or back of the line often rode small horses instead, better for scouting or, let's be honest, for making a quick getaway if things went south. Oh, and camels have a knack for memorizing paths. They can remember water sources, shelter, and danger zones across hundreds of miles, even if you can't remember where you left your canteen an hour ago. It's said that veteran camels would sometimes steer the caravan themselves, tugging stubbornly toward a known oasis when the humans debated over a map. Imagine trusting your life to a creature that looks like it's perpetually judging your choices. Still, camels aren't invincible. They can get sick, they can get spooked, and yes, under certain bizarre conditions, they can get drunk. Fermented fruit, souring milk left too long in the heat, it's not common, but it's not impossible. And a camel that decides to go rogue can spell disaster for a tightly packed caravan. You shift again, trying to find a comfortable position that doesn't exist, and glance over at the caravan leader, a grizzled veteran whose face looks like it was carved out of old leather. He pats his camel's flank with a familiarity that borders on affection. You can't tell whether he's murmuring encouragement or subtle threats. Camels are the reason the Silk Roads existed at all. Before them, horses tried and mostly failed to manage the arid stretches. Oxen were too slow and water-dependent. Mules gave up before the first sand dune. Without camels, there would be no dazzling silks in Rome, no sparkling gems in Chang'an, no cinnamon scenting the kitchens of distant Europe. And so you sway on, in the company of these reluctant heroes, feeling the weight of history, and the precariousness of your seating arrangement, with every jolt. The wind kicks up a bit, peppering your face with fine sand, and somewhere behind you, a camel lets out a deep, guttural belch. You can't help but chuckle, wondering if it's a warning, a protest, or just another reminder. Out here, the camel rules the road, and you're just along for the ride. The sun edges lower, bleeding orange and purple into the endless sky as you approach the shimmering outline of the city. It's not the towering marble metropolis you might expect. It's low, sprawling, dusty at the edges. But to weary travelers, it gleams like a treasure chest cracked open. Merv. Now, if you've never heard of Merv, don't feel bad. Most people haven't. But during the height of the Silk Roads, this desert jewel was one of the largest, busiest cities on earth, the place where traders, scholars, and opportunists of all stripes collided. And here's the kicker, Merv wasn't famous because it was convenient. Oh no! It was famous precisely because it wasn't. Nestled deep in the Karakum Desert, Merv sat awkwardly between obvious routes. Getting there involved a mess of compromises, detours around treacherous sand dunes, dangerous river crossings, the occasional bribe to local warlords. Yet somehow, it thrived. Historians still argue whether Merv's strategic placement was brilliance or sheer luck. Was it deliberate, a calculated move to control the traffic of goods? Or was it a happy accident, the city flourishing because there simply wasn't a better option within a camel's spit of water? What's undeniable is that Merv became a crossroads where East met West, not just in commerce, but in culture, ideas, and even bacteria. More on that unfortunate part later. Its libraries were legendary, its markets a kaleidoscope of languages and currencies. You could walk past a stall selling Persian carpets, dodge a boy hawking Indian spices, and nearly trip over a monk copying Buddhist sutras, all before breakfast. Here's a quirky Merv detail for your dusty mental scrapbook. The city was famed for its ice houses, giant, ancient refrigerators dug deep into the earth and insulated with straw and clay. In the dead of summer, when the desert could cook an egg on a rock, Mervians were nibbling on frozen sherbets like they invented air conditioning. You guide your camel through the city gates, creaking and groaning like an old man getting out of bed. The smell hits you first, a potent mix of spices, sweat, roasting meat, and something you sincerely hope is incense and not something more organic. Merchants holler in a dozen tongues, their stalls piled high with goods, bolts of embroidered silk, gleaming ceramics, lumps of raw lapis, pungent wheels of cheese. And yes, off in a quieter corner, a man you're pretty sure is trying to sell fermented camel milk. You dismount, legs wobbling, and hand off your reins to a stable boy who looks at your camel the way a waiter looks at a customer who's about to order something annoying. The caravanserai looms ahead, a massive, rectangular fortress with thick mud brick walls. Caravanserais were the lifeblood of the Silk Road, equal parts hotel, fortress, and emergency repair shop. Inside, you'll find traders tallying their goods, scribes jotting down contracts, and cooks preparing meals heavy on flatbreads and lentils, light on culinary imagination. You shuffle in, past the heavy wooden doors studded with iron nails, and sigh as the cool shade swallows you. The interior courtyard bustles, camels being unloaded, disputes over spice weights erupting into polite shouting matches, and tired travelers sprawled against the walls, sipping water as if it's liquid gold. You drop your pack onto a vacant spot and stretch, joints popping audibly. Around you, the murmur of deals being struck hums like a background symphony. In Merv, every corner breathes commerce. Every face you see is a thread in the tapestry of the Silk Roads. You lean back, feeling the ache in your bones dull under the caravanserai shelter, and wonder how many more cities like Merv rose and fell along these shifting paths, how many detours, accidents, or, say, drunken camels shaped the rise and ruin of entire empires. And outside, the desert wind still blows, indifferent, eternal, waiting to bury today's footprints just as it did all the ones before. You settle into the slow rhythm of caravanserai life, unpacking, haggling, swapping stories. But tonight, something else tempts your curiosity. Beyond the walls, just past the camel yard and the bustling stalls, you catch the unmistakable whiff of fermentation. Yes, you're about to stumble into one of the lesser-known delights and disasters of the Silk Roads, booze. You follow your nose to a squat clay building where traders gather, their laughter bubbling up into the darkening sky. Inside, a tapestry of smells hits you, sour, sweet, smoky, earthy. This, you realize, is where Silk Road travelers wound down, one clay jug at a time. Historians still argue whether fermented beverages were a travel necessity or an indulgence. Considering the quality of water on these routes, spoiler alert, it was terrible. You start to see why fermentation had its appeal. Alcohol kills bacteria. A sip of beer or wine could mean the difference between a refreshing drink and a week of wishing you hadn't. But what you find here isn't the wine of French vineyards or the beer of German brewers. No, along the Silk Roads, people got creative. The drink on offer tonight? Kumis, fermented mare's milk, tangy, lightly alcoholic, and very much an acquired taste. It was popular across the steppes where dairy ruled the diet. And yes, camels sometimes produced their own version when milk went sour under the desert sun. Here's your quirky fact. Kumis was so prized that in some places, it was used as tribute for khans and kings. Imagine delivering a tax payment in jugs of funky, fermented milk. Not exactly the gold coin vibe you might expect, but highly valuable all the same. You watch as a group of traders, Persians, Sogdians, Turks, raise their rough ceramic cups. Their toasts are a jumble of languages, but the sentiment is universal. May the road rise to meet you, and the bandits be too drunk to notice. You sip cautiously. The drink fizzes strangely on your tongue, sour and sharp. Not terrible, but certainly distinctive. You try not to make a face. Around you, the laughter grows louder, the talk looser. Deals are struck, old rivalries set aside for the evening. Even your camel, hobbled outside, seems to hum with the relaxed energy of the place. But, and it's a big but, this relaxed atmosphere wasn't without its risks. Sometimes the jugs of fermented milk or wine were poorly sealed. A hungry, curious camel could nose its way into trouble, knocking over pots, slurping up what was inside, and staggering drunkenly through the camp. Historians, with a fondness for footnotes, still argue whether this was common or rare. But the idea persists in merchant tales. A wayward camel, belly sloshing with kumis or spoiled dates, weaving its way into chaos. Some caravans lost entire night's sleep corralling tipsy beasts, while others blamed lost cargo on one such incident. And if a drunken camel wandered too far? Well, remember how camels are famously stubborn. Once a camel decided it had found a better path, or a better watering hole, it could be nearly impossible to convince it otherwise. Traders had no choice but to follow. You tilt back your cup and watch as another merchant spins a wild story about a camel that led his grandfather's caravan into a new oasis, one that turned out to be the perfect midway stop between two major cities. Was it luck? Was it nonsense? Or was it, once again, a drunk camel's misguided determination? Whatever the truth, you can't help but marvel at the way these stories stick, weaving themselves into the larger, messier tapestry of Silk Road history. The stars blink to life overhead as you finish your drink. The night air is cooler now, the desert's blistering heat giving way to a chill that creeps into your bones. You rise, legs slightly unsteady, not from the kumis, you insist, and make your way back to the caravanserai. Behind you, the laughter continues, warm and wild under the endless sky. Tomorrow you'll move on, tracing a path that, if the legends are true, might owe its existence to one drunken camel's midnight adventure. Morning slithers in slowly, a hazy blur of pale gold light and the low, familiar groans of camels being readied for another day's trudge. You stretch, joints crackling, and toss a final glance back at Merv's battered gates before nudging your ride forward. Today's destination is a little less glamorous but no less crucial, a caravanserai tucked along the next leg of the journey, one of hundreds, maybe thousands, that peppered the Silk Roads like scattered waypoints in the wilderness. If you're picturing a luxurious roadside inn with fresh sheets and complimentary breakfast, bless your optimism. The reality is, cozier. And by cozy, I mean packed with traders, camels, chickens, suspicious bundles of definitely not illegal goods, and smells so layered you'd need a flowchart to identify them all. Historians still argue whether caravanserais were originally royal projects, outposts sponsored by empires to encourage commerce, or grassroots creations by merchant guilds looking out for their own interests. Either way, they became lifelines, offering a rare bit of security and civilization in an otherwise unforgiving world. You finally spot the structure on the horizon, a low, square fortress hunched against the sand like it's been bracing against a storm for 1,000 years. As you get closer, the walls reveal themselves, thick mud brick, sun-cracked and laced with ancient graffiti. Symbols, names, bad poetry, some of it looks fresh, as if a bored merchant scrawled it while waiting for a stubborn camel to finish its lunch. Caravanserais were designed for practicality. You ride through the single, narrow entrance, a deliberate bottleneck to prevent bandit raids, and into a wide, open courtyard. Around the edges are arched alcoves where travelers huddle, sorting their wares, bartering quietly, napping in the shade. And oh, the chaos! Merchants argue over bolt lengths of silk and the purity of saffron powder. Camels bellow and kneel, rolling their eyes at the whole ordeal. Chickens, inexplicably, roam free, as if they own the place. Somewhere near the center, a small market has popped up, unofficial but tolerated, where you can buy everything from dried figs to what might be a knockoff Greek statue. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you. Caravanserai is often doubled as information hubs. Need to know if the pass ahead is blocked by snow? Wondering if bandits are more active this season? Eager for the latest gossip from the Chinese court or rumors from the Roman frontiers? The Caravanserai had you covered. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a crowded airport lounge mixed with a marketplace and a slightly aggressive Facebook group. You dismount, grateful to put your feet on solid ground, even if that ground is sticky with camel spit and unidentifiable mush. As you unload your pack, you catch snippets of conversation, a warning about a treacherous river crossing, a joke about a Sogdian merchant who lost his pants betting on a foot race, and, yes, the inevitable drunken camel story. Every caravan has one. A tale of a camel that wandered off with half a caravan's cargo, a merchant chasing it for miles, a new route discovered, a shortcut found, a fortune made or lost. Whether any of it's true doesn't seem to matter anymore. The stories are told, retold, embroidered, and passed on like family heirlooms. You grin as you remember last night's kumis-fueled laughter and settle against a wall, letting the heat leach from your tired limbs. Someone passes around a battered lute, and a low, melodic tune fills the air, weaving a kind of spell over the weary travelers. For all its dust and discomfort, the Caravanserai offers something precious: community. A fragile, fleeting togetherness of people bound by the same risks, the same hopes, the same endless road stretching ahead. And somewhere out there, maybe even tonight, a camel will tip a jar, slurp too deeply, and set off on a crooked, drunken path that just might change history all over again. You close your eyes for a moment, the music and the murmur of languages washing over you, and let yourself drift, not into sleep, not yet, but into the timeless rhythm of the road. You rise with a stiff groan, brush the sand off your cloak, and lead your camel, grumbling, of course, back onto the trail. The air is crisp, the kind of dry cold that fools you into thinking the desert is gentle. It's not. It's just patient. As you and the caravan snake away from the safety of the caravanserai walls, the landscape widens again, big and blank and humming with heat that isn't even visible yet. You find yourself replaying that old, half-drunken story from the night before, the one about the camel, the detour, and the unplanned discovery. And now, here it is, the camel incident, step by step, just as the legends tell it. Historians, ever skeptical, still argue whether it really happened this way. But the tale persists, stitched into the fabric of Silk Road myth like a stubborn thread. Picture it, a caravan setting up camp near an oasis. Traders busy themselves with the usual end-of-day chores, tending to animals, bartering rations, arguing about who snores the loudest. Meanwhile, the camels are left to graze, hobbling about, tails flicking at flies. Enter one curious camel. A clever one, or just a greedy sniffer, depending on how you spin it. It stumbles upon a broken amphora leaking its contents into the sand, spoiled wine, perhaps, or date mash fermenting just a bit too eagerly in the desert sun. Either way, the camel doesn't waste time questioning the vintage. It slurps up the mess enthusiastically. Here's the quirky bit: camels are remarkably tolerant creatures, but a stomachful of impromptu alcohol can turn even the most reliable pack animal into a one-camel parade of poor decisions. The camel, now tipsy and emboldened, starts to wander, not back toward camp, mind you, but away. Into the dunes. Off the map. Straight into the parts of the desert labeled by early cartographers as "here be dragons," or worse, "here be sandstorms." At first, the caravan doesn't notice. A missing camel isn't unusual. They wander. They sulk. They throw tantrums. But as dawn creeps in and the camel still hasn't reappeared, along with half the pack animals it knocked loose in its drunken spree, concern sharpens into panic. You can almost see it, can't you? A gaggle of bleary-eyed traders staggering into the morning light, shielding their faces against the rising sun, peering into the emptiness. No camel. No silk bundles. No barrels of spice. And so, grumbling and cursing in at least 5 languages, they mount a rescue mission. They follow the scattered tracks, weaving through dunes and rocky outcrops. Hours turn to a day turns to 2. Supplies run low. Tempers fray. But here's the twist. Instead of wandering deeper into deadly wasteland, the drunken camel stumbles, quite by accident, onto a previously unknown series of shallow wells and scraggly shrubs, signs of life where the map showed nothing. Water in the desert is gold. It's survival. It's a godsend. Seeing this, the merchants make a snap decision. Maybe it's the desperation talking. Maybe it's the spark of opportunity. But they reroute. They adjust their path to swing by these hidden watering holes. Word spreads, as it always does. Soon, other caravans are testing this new detour. It's not perfect, it's longer, slightly rougher, but the water makes up for it. It's safer, too, avoiding territories where bandit attacks had spiked in recent years. Over time, the detour becomes standard. What was once a drunken animal's meandering path hardens into a roadbed carved by countless hooves and wheels and sandaled feet. A quirk of fate. A clumsy mistake. A staggering beast with questionable taste and a stubborn streak that rivaled empires. And just like that, the mighty Silk Roads, the lifeline of continents, shifted a few degrees off course, thanks, if you believe the stories, to a camel who couldn't handle its drink. You glance sideways at your own camel. It blinks slowly at you, chewing something unidentifiable with the patience of a creature who has absolutely no deadlines. History is full of grand battles, wise kings, daring explorers. But out here, it's the small things, the drunken camel, the spilled wine, the half-forgotten detour, that leave the deepest tracks. You click your tongue, adjust your grip on the reins, and keep moving, the trail stretching forward, uncertain and inviting, like a story still being written. You plod on, the sun now a molten coin overhead, each step stirring up a fine mist of dust that clings to your skin, your clothes, even your eyelashes. As you march, you realize something that every Silk Road traveler knew deep in their bones. This place is alive, but it is not your friend. Natural disasters are not rare here, they're expected. Out here, a sandstorm doesn't politely announce itself, it ambushes you. The desert is a trickster, as mischievous and cruel as any mythic god, and even the most carefully plotted route can vanish under a whim of wind. Historians still argue whether sandstorms or human stubbornness were the bigger danger along the Silk Roads. Personally, as you squint into the hazy distance and feel grit between your teeth, you're leaning toward both. Picture this, a caravan, much like yours, slogging along a well-worn path. The lead scout smells the change before he sees it, a sharp tang in the air, a rawness that prickles the back of his neck. Before long, the horizon darkens, not with approaching night but with a wall of sand hundreds of feet high, rolling forward like a living beast. There's no outrunning it. There's no hiding from it. All you can do is hunker down, tie cloth across your face, cling to your camel, and pray to whatever gods you think are listening. And when the storm passes, well, congratulations. You're no longer anywhere near your original path. Landmarks have vanished. Dunes have shifted. That familiar rock formation you used for navigation is buried under meters of sand. Good luck getting your bearings. It's little wonder that Silk Road travelers developed an almost superstitious fear of the desert. Quirky little tidbit for you, some merchants would carry jars of sand from the previous oasis and sprinkle it around their campsites at night, believing it would protect them from losing their way come morning. But even when the weather behaved, which was rare, stubbornness remained a constant, two-legged hazard. Humans are creatures of habit, and Silk Road traders were no exception. Once a route was established, many would stick to it no matter how dangerous or inefficient it became. Bandits? Sandstorms? Shrug. Extortionate tolls from petty warlords? They grumbled, but they kept moving forward, heads down, boots dragging. Changing the route was risky. It meant abandoning known waterholes, trusted rest stops, and established alliances. It meant maps became useless, and gossip, your most valuable currency, was outdated overnight. It wasn't just a logistical nightmare, it was social suicide. Yet the desert, indifferent and eternal, didn't care about human habits. Routes had to shift eventually, forced by dried-up rivers, collapsed empires, or the stray whims of a drunken camel wandering off course. You can't help but smile at the irony. Merchants, with all their planning and foresight, often clung to old paths until sheer survival forced their hand. Sometimes the sandstorm had to wipe the map clean. Sometimes a camel had to bumble into a better way forward. You pull your scarf tighter around your face as a gust of wind flings sand into your ears. Your camel, ever pragmatic, merely turns its head sideways and blinks lazily. Ahead, the road, if you can call it that, splits. One path continues straight, worn smooth by generations of travelers. The other veers off, rougher, uncertain, but rumor has it that there's a new well that way. Fresh water, fewer tolls, maybe even safety. You hesitate, torn between the comfort of the known and the gamble of the new. The wind whispers around you, carrying with it a secret that all Silk Road travelers eventually learn: change isn't the enemy. It's the only reason the road exists at all. You nudge your camel toward the untested path, feeling the jolt of nerves and excitement mingle in your gut. Behind you, the old road stretches like a memory. Ahead, the sand shifts and dances, covering your footprints almost as fast as you make them. And you press forward, following a trail that might just, if the stories are true, owe its existence to a moment of drunken stubbornness in the eternal, mischievous desert. The caravan settles into its new route with cautious optimism, the camels trudging in a steady, endless rhythm that could almost lull you to sleep if the saddle weren't doing such horrible things to your backside. But as the trail unwinds before you, another force makes itself felt. Not the sand, not the mountains, not even the weather. No, this particular force is human, clever, and far more persistent: the Sogdians. If you haven't heard of them, don't worry, most people haven't. They were never the kind of empire that left behind giant stone statues or endless reams of royal decrees. Instead, they specialized in something far sneakier: making money without lifting a sword. Historians still argue whether the Sogdians were merchants first and diplomats second, or vice versa. What everyone agrees on is that without them, the Silk Roads wouldn't have been much more than a few dusty footpaths with occasional regrettable detours, like the Drunken Camel incident. You crest a low rise and spot a familiar sign: the brightly colored fabrics of a Sogdian trading tent. These middlemen, masters of haggling, brokering, and subtle manipulation, manage the traffic of goods, information, and even ideas between East and West. They spoke multiple languages, married into local elites, and could, if pressed, probably sell you your own camel. Here's a quirky fact: Sogdians were so renowned for their trade skills that their letters have been found across China, Persia, and even India, scribbled notes between cousins talking about everything from exchange rates to family gossip. It's like ancient WhatsApp, but with more camels and fewer emojis. You guide your beast closer to the tent, where a Sogdian merchant sits cross-legged on a rug, lazily inspecting a tray of polished jade trinkets. Around him, other traders haggle over silk, spices, and even a suspiciously shiny sword that may or may not have a legitimate history. He greets you in a language that's an effortless blend of Persian, Chinese, and something else you can't quite place, a living reminder that the Silk Road wasn't just a highway for goods, it was a river of languages, customs, and contradictions. And here's the clever bit: the Sogdians didn't just follow the Silk Road. They shaped it. They set up trading outposts, whispered in the ears of city governors, and rerouted caravans not for safety or efficiency, but for profit. If a certain route kept their markets full and their pockets heavy, you can bet your last dried fig they'd find a way to make that path more appealing, or at least convince you it was. Rumors swirl that Sogdian middlemen encouraged certain detours, like, say, the one your caravan is currently testing, by subtly spreading tales of new wells and safer paths, whether or not those claims were entirely, factual. The Drunken Camel legend? Maybe not just a freak accident. Maybe, just maybe, nudged along by a few well-placed stories and a little creative map doodling. You haggle half-heartedly for a small jade pendant, mostly to be polite, and the merchant beams at you, teeth flashing gold. You leave with the pendant, a few coins lighter, and the unsettling feeling that you've once again been gently, expertly outmaneuvered. As you shuffle back to your caravan, pendant clanking in your pocket, you realize that the true architects of the Silk Roads weren't emperors or generals. They were the Sogdians, whisperers, schemers, merchants who understood that history is less about battles and more about bargains. You mount your camel again and cast a glance over your shoulder at the colorful tent, now receding into the dust. Out here, the road doesn't care who claims to control it. The road listens to those who move the goods, spread the stories, and, when necessary, tip a drunken camel just far enough off course to change the world. Your caravan trudges onward, the line of camels weaving and swaying like a drunken snake against the rolling horizon. It's hypnotic, almost soothing, until the merchants around you begin pulling strange objects from their packs, chatting animatedly about their latest trades. Welcome to the weird and wonderful world of Silk Road cargo, where it turns out people were willing to haul just about anything if it promised a decent profit. Everyone knows about the silk, of course. The spices. Maybe the teas, the porcelain, the bolts of brocade shimmering like bottled rainbows. But tucked between the expected goods were the truly bizarre. You glance at the merchant next to you, who is carefully unwrapping what looks suspiciously like an ostrich egg. Huge, fragile, absurd. These eggs, transported over thousands of miles, were prized curiosities in the courts of China and Persia. Rich folks loved them, proof you could afford to pay for something utterly useless and fantastically difficult to ship without breaking. Kind of like the ancient version of flaunting a fragile designer vase you definitely don't use. A few camels ahead, another trader proudly shows off a lump of rhinoceros horn, polished to a high sheen. Historians still argue whether the ancient world really believed in the magical properties attributed to rhino horn, curing ailments, enhancing vitality, warding off evil spirits, or if it was just another flex, a pricey bauble that shouted, "Look how rich I am." And then there were the live animals, parrots in bamboo cages, peacocks fanning their gaudy tails at every rest stop, and even, allegedly, a shipment of Persian cats bound for some distant emperor who just had to have a royal feline companion. You reach into your own satchel and pull out something more modest, small rolls of fine paper, recently acquired in a clever trade back in Merv. Lightweight, valuable, and less likely to bite or break compared to, say, a very cranky parrot. Here's your quirky tidbit: the Silk Roads didn't just move goods, they moved weirdness. Ideas, fads, foods. The ancient world was surprisingly trendy, and if a noble in Rome heard that a Chinese courtier was wearing a certain style of robe dyed with a particular shade of indigo, you could bet your last copper coin that robe makers in Alexandria would be scrambling to imitate it within the year. Sometimes it wasn't even about the object itself but the idea of it. Take musk, for instance, an animal secretion so pungent it made your eyes water, yet so coveted that merchants treated it like liquid gold. One caravan master you overhear brags about securing a bundle of musk pods, wrapped carefully in silk to contain the smell, bound for the perfumers of Damascus who will, no doubt, dilute it into a perfume more tolerable to the human nose. You smirk at the thought. Somewhere, someone is paying a fortune for the privilege of smelling faintly like the backside of a musk deer. Trade was messy. Trade was illogical. Trade was, at times, a little ridiculous. But trade worked. And trade didn't care how odd the cargo seemed. If it could be sold, it was worth the effort. If it could spark wonder or envy, even better. If it survived the trek across half the known world without getting smashed, lost, or stolen, it became more than an object, it became a trophy. You guide your camel along the winding path, your modest bundle of paper secure in your pack, and glance at the odd parade of goods swaying alongside you. Ostrich eggs. Rhino horn. Exotic birds and bundles of fragrant resins. Proof, if any were needed, that the Silk Road didn't just connect cities, it connected imaginations. And if some of that cargo tipped drunkenly into a new detour now and then? Well, the world was a stranger, richer place for it. As the caravan snakes along, you can feel a shift in the atmosphere, not in the air, which remains stubbornly dry and dusty, but in the caravan itself. Merchants straighten their backs. The chatter softens to reverent murmurs. Even the camels seem a bit less cranky. You're approaching the heart of it all, the reason the Silk Road bears its silken name. Silk itself. There's a palpable reverence for these delicate bolts of fabric, packed carefully in layered bundles and secured against the grime of travel. They shimmer even in the dull desert light, folds of red, gold, green, and a dozen other hues that seem to trap and play with the sun. Historians still argue whether silk was more valuable by weight than gold at the height of its trade, and honestly, the merchants around you would likely snort and say, it depends on the season. But one thing's certain, silk was irresistible. To the Romans, who called it saricum, it was a thing of mystery. To the Parthians and Persians, it was a marker of power and refinement. To the Chinese, it was so important that revealing the secret of its production was once punishable by death. Harsh, sure, but understandable when you realize that silk wasn't just a luxury, it was a state secret. Here's your quirky tidbit. For centuries, outsiders had no idea how silk was made. They thought it grew on trees or plants, like a weird, shiny cotton, or was harvested by magical creatures. The truth? Less magical, more buggy. Silk is the solidified spit of Bombyx mori caterpillars, silkworms, spun into cocoons and carefully unwound by patient, slightly grossed-out farmers. You trail a hand across a nearby merchant's bundle, feeling the fine, almost unreal smoothness of the fabric. It's cool against your fingertips, light as mist, but strong enough to endure a journey that would leave lesser goods shredded and ruined. Silk wasn't just cloth. It was power. Wearing silk told the world you could afford not only the finest things but the long, dangerous journey required to get them. Silk-robed emperors, adorned popes, lined the beds of the rich and the powerful. It was draped over altars and tombs, wrapped around scrolls of sacred text, and hoarded in treasuries as a mark of divine favor. Of course, silk also had a knack for sparking scandals. In ancient Rome, senators complained that silk robes were too sheer, too revealing for proper Roman modesty. Wearing it, they grumbled, was practically the same as being naked. Naturally, this only made it more popular. Human nature, 1. Senatorial outrage, 0. You glance around the caravan and spot a more discreet parcel, rolled tightly, bound in simple cloth. Not all silk was flashy. Some was plain, meant for dyeing later to suit a buyer's tastes. Others were embroidered with gold thread, precious stones sewn into the fabric itself, turning a simple garment into wearable wealth. Silk traveled the silk roads, but it also carried something else, secrets. Smuggled production techniques. Forbidden dyes. Hidden messages embroidered in private for the eyes of kings and queens alone. And as the silk spread, it wove together far more than just trade agreements. It tied distant cultures into a shimmering, tangled web of influence, desire, and competition. You sit a little taller in the saddle, feeling, if only for a moment, like a small thread in that vast, invisible tapestry. A merchant from Rome might one day drape himself in the very silk you now guard. A princess in a distant Persian court might flutter a fan made from the same bolt of cloth you just touched. All thanks to the silk roads, and perhaps, if the story is true, thanks in a very small way to a drunken camel that once took an accidental shortcut, dragging the world along behind it. The path winds on. You shift in your saddle, the shimmer of silk catching the corner of your eye like a promise, and follow it deeper into the desert's endless whisper. The next few days unfold like a long, dry sigh, footstep after footstep, hoofbeat after hoofbeat, across the unchanging dunes. You lose yourself in the rhythm, lulled by the swaying of the camel and the endless expanse of sand. But monotony is deceptive. It hides what's really being carried, not just silks, spices, and ostrich eggs, but secrets, spores, and sickness. You shift uncomfortably in your saddle as the merchant riding beside you sneezes, twice, into the crook of his arm. A harmless cold? Maybe. Or maybe not. You're not a doctor, and frankly, neither were most of the people who first realized that the Silk Roads didn't just trade wealth, they trade plague. Historians still argue whether it was the Silk Road or later maritime routes that spread disease faster, but most agree on this much. Without these trade arteries, the world would have been a quieter, and possibly healthier, place for a lot longer. Here's your quirky tidbit. Along with the usual exotic cargo, Silk Road merchants sometimes unknowingly transported stowaways, fleas, rats, and microscopic passengers tucked away in grain sacks and wool bundles. These freeloaders didn't pay customs duties, but they exacted a price all the same. The most infamous? Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the bubonic plague. No one knew it at the time, of course. Medieval doctors were still years away from blaming bad air, planetary alignments, or wearing suspiciously bird-like masks filled with herbs. Out here, among the dunes and the caravan bells, sickness was just an unfortunate hazard, like bandits or sandstorms. If someone coughed or broke out in buboes, the best you could hope for was to be far, far away. But it wasn't just the Black Death centuries later. Even in earlier times, lesser-known epidemics flared up along the routes, carried from one bustling market to another, one packed caravanserai to the next. Some historians believe that outbreaks of smallpox and measles, diseases that would later ravage empires, first found their way westward thanks to traders and their cargo-laden camels. And it wasn't all bad, of course. Along with pathogens, the Silk Roads also carried knowledge, treatises on medicine from China, herbal remedies from India, surgical tools from Persia. Ideas about quarantine and sanitation traveled, albeit slowly, tucked into the saddlebags alongside bolts of silken bags of spices. You glance around at your fellow travelers. Some cough. Some look pale under the desert sun. Most seem fine. But the truth is, no one really knows what tiny invaders might be hitching a ride among your wares. Still, traders traveled. Merchants sold. Caravans moved. The risk was part of the job. When the choice was between a slow death by poverty and a quick one by plague, most bet on fortune favoring the bold, or at least the well-armed and stubborn. You tighten the scarf around your face, more to keep out the dust than the germs, but it gives you a small sense of comfort anyway. Your camel snorts and plods onward, blissfully indifferent to the existential horror riding in your saddlebags. Because here's the thing no one likes to admit, the Silk Road wasn't built on silk alone. It was built on exchange, in all its messy, miraculous, and terrifying forms. Goods, yes. Ideas, certainly. Disease, unfortunately. It was the world's first truly global network, tangled and imperfect and, occasionally, deadly. And if, by chance, some tipsy camel blundered into a shortcut that carried a plague a little faster, a little farther, well, that too became part of the sprawling, invisible story that the maps would never tell. The caravan plods forward. You squint into the heat haze, trying not to think too hard about the unseen passengers you might be carrying, and remind yourself, out here, survival depends not on fear, but on moving forward. Always forward. As the days grind on and the caravan inches closer to its next distant destination, you start hearing whispers, low murmurs pass from camel to camel, trader to trader, about the aftermath of that Drunken Camel incident. It's become legend, mutating and twisting like a rumor in a small village. You lean in at the evening campfire, listening as a weather-beaten merchant recounts the tale, his voice a mix of reverence and mischief. According to him, the Drunken Camel fallout wasn't just a funny story shared to kill time on long treks. It sparked real, lasting change, setting off a chain reaction that no one, not even the camel, could have predicted. The story goes that the new route discovered by the wayward beast wasn't just safer, it was more efficient. It skirted dangerous bandit zones, hit more reliable water sources, and avoided a notorious toll station where a petty desert warlord charged merchants half their profits just for the privilege of passing through. Historians still argue whether this was the true origin of the route's popularity or just convenient storytelling, but what's clear is that within a generation, the detour wasn't a detour anymore. It was the route. Caravans doubled, then tripled. Towns that once languished in the desert's shadow found themselves bustling with new trade. Wells were dug deeper. Caravanserais sprang up like hardy desert shrubs. And here's your quirky tidbit. In one of these burgeoning towns, small, dusty, barely more than a cluster of tents at first, someone erected a statue. Not of a king, not of a conqueror, but of a camel. A wobbly, slightly lopsided camel, carved in rough stone, one leg lifted mid-stumble, head tilted as if searching for another drink. You can still find fragments of that statue today, if you know where to look. Just a few worn blocks of sandstone, half swallowed by the desert, whispering of a time when an animal's misstep redrew the world's greatest trade network. But not everyone celebrated the change. Old cities, once thriving thanks to the original routes, withered. Their wells dried up from disuse. Their markets shriveled. Entire communities found themselves bypassed, watching as the lifeblood of commerce flowed elsewhere. The winners thrived, the losers faded, and the desert, indifferent as always, swallowed the ruins without a second thought. You roll over on your bedroll, gazing up at the stars, imagining what it must have been like for those merchants who clung to the old paths, refusing to adapt. Did they curse the camel? Did they laugh at the foolishness of those who followed a beast's drunken wanderings? Or did they, quietly and without ceremony, pack up their goods and follow the new trail, swallowing their pride for the sake of survival? Progress rarely looks like progress when you're living it. Sometimes it looks like foolishness, or disaster, or in this case, a camel with questionable judgment and a remarkable sense of mischief. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders as a chill breeze picks up, carrying the scent of distant water and distant dreams. Maybe tomorrow you'll pass one of those new towns, the ones born in the wake of a wayward beast and a lucky accident. Maybe you'll see the faint outlines of that crumbling camel statue against the horizon, a small, forgotten monument to the absurdity that sometimes guides history more effectively than any emperor or general. And as you drift towards sleep, you can't help but smile at the thought, not all heroes wear crowns or brandish swords. Some have humps, a fondness for fermented fruit, and an uncanny knack for stumbling into greatness. Dawn smears itself across the sky in pale streaks of yellow and pink, and once again, you find yourself back in the saddle, the caravan stretching out ahead in a slow-moving procession of stubborn beasts and even more stubborn merchants. Today's ride feels different, though. There's a sense of disorientation, subtle but growing, as you notice how often the road seems to vanish, swallowed by the dunes or twisted out of shape by time. Maps? Laughable. They're useful until the moment the land decides it's tired of playing nice. You glance at the man riding beside you, an older trader with sun-leathered skin and a 1,000-yard stare, who's muttering curses at his map as if it personally betrayed him. Because here's the brutal truth, mapmakers couldn't keep up. Historians still argue whether ancient geographers ever managed to produce truly reliable Silk Road maps. Some scholars think it's a miracle any maps survived at all, others point out that many of the maps we revere today were optimistic at best. You pull a battered scroll from your satchel, careful not to tear its brittle edges. The map is a patchwork of known and guessed-at features, crooked lines representing rivers, exaggerated mountains, oases marked with tiny, hopeful dots. But it's already outdated. You know it. The man beside you knows it. The desert knows it, and frankly, the desert is winning. See, the land doesn't stay put. Rivers dry up or change course. Sandstorms bury landmarks. Towns rise and vanish in less time than it takes for a camel to grow a decent winter coat. A map that was accurate last season might be dangerously wrong now, a deadly joke played on those too trusting. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Early Silk Road navigators often used the stars for orientation, not unlike sailors. They memorized constellations, traced paths by night, and developed a keen instinct for how terrain should feel underfoot. More than a few caravan masters claimed to smell their way to the next water source, a skill skeptics scoffed at until they got lost and desperate themselves. Even more entertaining? Some maps included places that never existed. Mythical cities of gold, enchanted forests, lakes that shimmered with jewels instead of water. Not necessarily because the cartographers were gullible, though, let's be honest, sometimes they were, but because maps were part science, part marketing. A city didn't need to be real if enough traders believed it was. You tuck the map away as the caravan veers slightly to the east, following not the line on the parchment but the older, wiser path worn into the earth itself, a path not drawn but remembered. Memory, not maps, kept caravans alive. Stories passed down from one trader to another. The well near the third crooked acacia tree has gone dry. The pass through the mountains was blocked by a rockslide last spring. The desert bandits moved north this year. Stick to the southern route. If you're lucky, your caravan master has a good memory and better instincts. If not, well, you might find yourself wondering how fast you can run in a sandstorm. Ahead, a shout breaks the monotony. One of the scouts has spotted smoke, civilization, or at least the closest thing to it out here. A town, an oasis, perhaps a way station for the weary and the wise. You feel a flicker of hope, maybe even the faintest pang of gratitude to all the forgotten travelers who trudged this way before you, leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace, a ghost road you can barely see but somehow trust. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you imagine that drunken camel, staggering off course, setting a new trail by sheer accident, its wobbly footprints eventually becoming the ruts your own camel now follows. You press on, the map crinkling in your pack, useless but somehow comforting all the same. Because out here, the road isn't drawn. It's remembered, whispered, stumbled upon. And sometimes, the best guide isn't a map at all, it's the stubborn, unshakable memory of those who dared to walk it first. You crest a low ridge and the wind shifts, carrying with it the scent of something rare and wonderful, water. The caravan stirs, camels lifting their heads, nostrils flaring. Humans might pretend to be tough out here, but the camels are the true connoisseurs of survival, and if they smell water, you follow. The descent reveals what you've been hoping for, a cluster of palms, the glint of a pool, low stone walls crumbling under the sun's unblinking stare. A town, or what's left of one. Historians still argue whether the Silk Roads built these towns or the towns built the Silk Roads. It's one of those chicken or egg situations that scholars love to debate over endless cups of bitter tea. But out here, you see the truth. Survival demanded these mirage towns, and in return, these towns demanded the road. You guide your camel through the narrow gate, where a few guards, sleepy and sunbaked, wave you in with barely a glance. Inside, life clings stubbornly to the dust. Traders haggle, smiths hammer, children chase goats with shrieking laughter. It's not much, but it's enough. Yet there's an uneasy undercurrent. You notice shutters drawn tight against the midday glare, market stalls half-stocked, walls patched with too fresh mud. This town is alive, but barely. Here's your quirky tidbit. Many of these Silk Road towns existed in a constant state of precarious balance. One dry season, one shift in the caravan routes, one outbreak of banditry, and they'd be gone. Just like that. The desert would move in, grain by grain, swallowing the streets, the wells, the memories. You've seen it before. Skeleton towns, abandoned and sand-choked, where broken pottery and half-collapsed walls tell stories no one's around to hear. Towns that once echoed with the clatter of coins and the murmur of 20 languages, now home only to lizards and whispers. Some even say, and here's the bit historians hate but storytellers love, that certain towns would simply vanish overnight. No bow, no storm, just gone. Caravans would return to find nothing but wind-scoured foundations and the occasional scrap of fabric tangled in a thorn bush. Cursed, some muttered. Unlucky, others said. Economically obsolete, the scholars grumble in their footnotes. But you, sitting in the patchy shade of a leaning date palm, chewing on a strip of dried meat tougher than old sandals, can't help but feel the weight of it. This town survives for now, but already you can see the signs, the cracked well rim, the faded market banners, the impatient way merchants glance at the horizon, calculating their next move. Trade is a river, and rivers change course. When the water moves on, the towns that once thrived beside it wither, starved of their lifeblood. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's not drought or war that shifts the current. Sometimes it's something as small and silly as a camel who couldn't hold its liquor, staggering off into the sand and tugging the world's attention with it. You sip from your battered water skin and stare at the small bustle around you, knowing that in a generation, maybe less, this could all be gone. The Silk Road is a lifeline, yes, but it's a fickle one. The caravan calls to regroup. Merchants lash their bundles tighter. Camels groan and complain, as is their custom, and you swing into the saddle once more. As you ride out, you don't look back. You know the desert will take care of what's left behind, folding it neatly into its endless dunes like it has 1,000 times before. The road ahead shimmers under the relentless sun, a thread stretching forward. Always forward. And you chase it, because out here, standing still is just a slower way to vanish. The caravan slinks back into the desert's embrace, and you fall once again into the dusty, hypnotic rhythm of travel. But as the sun climbs higher and the dunes shimmer like molten gold, the easy cadence falters. A ripple of tension snakes through the ranks. You feel it first in the way the camels hesitate, ears flicking. Then in the sudden, watchful silence of the merchants around you. You glance up and spot them. Specks at first, swirling like gnats at the edge of vision, but soon unmistakable, bandits. Historians still argue whether Silk Road banditry was exaggerated by fearful merchants or if it truly was the nightmare that travelers' diaries make it out to be. Judging by the tightening grips on sword hilts and the quick, furtive inventory checks happening all around you, you're guessing the threat was very real. You nudge your camel closer to the caravan center, a living, creaking barricade of beasts and bodies. Out here, there's no cavalry coming to your rescue. The nearest garrison could be days away. You and your companions are on your own, and the bandits know it. And here's a quirky tidbit. Bandits along the Silk Roads weren't always the ragged, desperate men of bandanas and horses you might picture. Some were professional outfits, well-organized, well-armed, and sometimes, embarrassingly, more disciplined than actual armies. They had their own hierarchies, codes, and occasionally, customer service. If you paid a toll, think of it as the please don't rob me tax. You could pass unharmed. Not today, though. The bandits circle closer, an unspoken question hovering in the heat. Will you fight? Will you run? Or will you hand it all over and hope for mercy? Caravans, it turns out, are built for more than just hauling goods. They're defensive machines. The camels are lashed together, flank to flank, forming a makeshift wall. Merchants grab bows, spears, daggers, whatever's at hand. Even the camel drivers, usually so gentle and aloof, hunch low with whips ready. You brace yourself, heart thudding painfully in your chest. All around, the air tightens. The first shout cracks across the dunes like a whip. Then the charge. Dust explodes, horses scream, and the world contracts into chaos. You clutch the reins, duck low, and, thankfully, your camel, perhaps sensing that heroics are not in its job description, plants its feet and refuses to budge. You peer around the furry bulk of your ride and watch as arrows arc, thud into sand, into hides, into unlucky flesh. Minutes, or was it hours, drag past. The caravan holds. The bandits, seeing no easy prize here, eventually peel away, retreating in a flurry of curses and hoofbeats, leaving behind a trail of churned sand and the faint, bitter scent of fear. As calm slowly seeps back into the caravan, you ease your death grip on the reins and wipe the sweat from your brow. Around you, merchants take stock, losses are murmured, minor wounds tended. Life continues, as it must. You glance down at your satchel, where your humble rolls of paper, less glamorous than silk, less precious than spices, lie undisturbed. You're grateful, in a quiet, exhausted sort of way. And you can't help but think, the Silk Roads weren't just avenues of commerce. They were gauntlets. Highways of hope and horror in equal measure. To travel them was to gamble not just with your fortune, but with your life. Maybe that's why the Drunken Camel story persists. In a world where even the best laid plans can be upended by a random dust storm or a bandit raid, there's comfort in the idea that a lurching, tipsy beast might stumble upon a better way. You kick your camel gently, and with a familiar groan, it lurches forward, rejoining the ragged procession. The road stretches ahead, indifferent, unchanged. But you, slightly bruised, slightly wiser, trudge onward, one foot in the ruts carved by countless others, chasing a future shaped as much by accidents as by ambition. The road ahead blurs into a shimmering mirage as the day drags on, the heat turning the horizon into a wavy, uncertain dreamscape. Your camel plods forward, unwavering, as if it too has given up hoping for any change in scenery. But change does come, not in the land, but in the banners flapping ahead. Bright, gaudy colors, unfamiliar emblems, soldiers in armor that glints even under the choking dust. As you draw closer, the caravan slows, merchants muttering and fidgeting, adjusting their loads and their attitudes. You're entering Empire territory, where things get complicated. Historians still argue whether the great empires, Han China, Persia, Byzantium, the Abbasids, helped stabilize the Silk Roads or just made everything worse by insisting on endless tolls, inspections, and declarations of sovereignty. If you ask the grumbling traders around you, the answer seems obvious: empires meddled, and mostly for their own profit. Here's a quirky tidbit: some empires didn't just tax the caravans, they tried to control the narrative. Official way stations were set up, complete with loyal scribes who helped traders register their goods, monitor their movements, and, not so coincidentally, report back to the capital. It was surveillance by ledger, bureaucracy with a sharp edge. You shift uneasily in your saddle as a soldier approaches, inspecting the caravan with a look that says he's seen it all and wasn't impressed the first time. He's not particularly interested in your faded cloak or your unimposing bundle of paper, but he eyes the silk bolts and spice sacks with greedy familiarity. The caravan leader slides from his camel, a few coins already discreetly palmed. It's a dance as old as the road itself, a little negotiation, a little bribery, and the implied threat of what happens if you're not cooperative. Empires love to think they own the Silk Roads. They drew their neat little lines on maps, declared trade cities official hubs, issued permits with seals and ribbons. But the Silk Roads, stubborn and sprawling, didn't care about lines on paper. They twisted and turned, slipping through mountain passes and desert wastes, weaving between kingdoms like water seeking cracks in a dam. Sometimes, the traders moved with the blessing of emperors. More often, they moved in spite of them. You can't help but grin at the thought, a network of backdoor deals and secret trails, shaped less by royal decree and more by the practical genius of the people who lived it. And yes, occasionally redirected by a drunken camel bumbling into undiscovered watering holes far from the watchful eyes of tax collectors. You hand over your travel token, a worn scrap of leather marked with a faded stamp, and hope it looks official enough. The soldier barely glances at it before waving you on. You let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding and urge your camel forward. Beyond the checkpoint, the road forks again. The official route is wide, packed with travelers, but lined with more soldiers, more tolls, more inspections. The unofficial route, narrower, dustier, less reliable, veers off toward the hills. You don't even hesitate. You guide your camel onto the smaller path, following the caravan leaders who know better than to tempt an empire's patience more than necessary. The Silk Roads belong not to those who try to trap them in tax ledgers, but to those who move, who adapt, who know that survival often lies in the shadowy spaces between power. And as you ride, you think of the empires that rose and fell along these routes, proud, glittering, and now mostly dust. And you think of the roads themselves, still here, still stubborn, still shifting. Just like that drunken camel, oblivious to the maps and the laws, forging a new path simply because it could. You adjust your scarf against the rising wind, the horizon tilting with the heat, and press forward, following not the empires, but the whispers of the sand and the memory of those who never needed a crown to shape the world. The caravan winds deeper into the hills now, where the air feels thinner and the sand gives way to stubborn shrubs clawing at patches of rocky ground. It's quieter here, the clamor of busy roads and empire checkpoints left behind. The caravan leaders ride closer together, murmuring in low tones. You catch snatches of words: steeper trail, new route, less patrols. It's clear what they're planning. Out here, where the world shrinks to the scrape of hooves on stone and the creak of overloaded saddles, there's always an eye toward the future. Because even the Silk Roads themselves, those grand arteries of trade and empire, weren't permanent. They shifted, twisted, broke apart and reformed like rivers carving new channels. And now, you're witnessing the beginning of another slow, grinding change, new beasts, new paths. Historians still argue whether the evolution of trade routes was driven more by innovation or necessity, but here, on this narrow, winding trail, you can see the answer in the shifting shapes of the caravan itself. Ahead, you spot something strange, unfamiliar silhouettes moving with surprising ease across the rocky terrain. They're not camels, not horses either. They're larger, broader across the chest, with thick coats and a patient, plodding gait that seems perfectly suited to these rugged trails. Yaks. Here's your quirky tidbit: as the Silk Roads pushed higher into the mountains and deeper into the uncharted wilds, traders began swapping camels for yaks and even pack goats in some regions. Camels were desert champions, no question, but even they had their limits. Yaks, with their shaggy coats and sure-footedness, could traverse icy passes in thin air that would leave a camel sulking and gasping. And it wasn't just the animals that changed. Routes adapted too, veering away from established desert cities that were drying up or crumbling under the weight of too many taxes and too few traders. New oases, newly discovered mountain passes, safer paths through once forbidding landscapes, each generation of traders built on the last, guided not by royal decrees but by necessity, ingenuity, and the slow accumulation of hard-won knowledge. You wonder if, years from now, travelers will look at the route you're trudging today and see it as the main Silk Road, or if it will fade like all the others, buried by shifting sands, remembered only in half-true stories and broken stones. The yak caravan passes you, their handlers nodding in greeting, faces lined by sun and wind and time. They're young, mostly, but their gear is sturdy, their loads balanced with care. No royal seals, no fancy tokens, just grit and experience and the kind of stubbornness that has always kept trade moving, no matter how many empires collapsed in the rear view. And somewhere in the very back of your mind, a thought hums quietly: progress doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with trumpets or banners. It shuffles forward, one dusty, unglamorous step at a time, like a drunken camel stumbling into an oasis no one knew existed. You watch the yak caravan vanish over the next ridge, their belt-covered harnesses jingling faintly, and urge your camel onward. It groans but obeys, as it always does. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the trail. You squint ahead, the horizon sharpening as the air cools, and for a moment you think you can see not just the road in front of you, but all the roads that have ever been. The ones that flourished. The ones that failed. The ones that, thanks to stubborn beasts and stubborn people, refuse to die. You shift in your saddle, the familiar creak of leather and bone keeping you company, and smile. The Silk Roads are alive, not in stone, not in maps, but in every footstep, every hoofbeat, every reckless, accidental choice that somehow changed the course of history. And so, Following the faintest traces of a trail beaten by countless souls before you, you ride on. The twilight deepens, the sky bleeding into dusky purples and velvety blues. The caravan slows, the camel's heavy footsteps softened by the cooling sand. You sit taller, shoulders aching but heart lighter, as the road beneath you folds into familiar patterns, worn smooth by centuries of travel. This is the final stretch, the culmination of a journey shaped by forces both grand and absurd. The grand kings in the vast empires, yes, but also the small, stubborn moments, a spilled jar, a lost camel, a drunken stumble into new territory. You think back to that infamous camel, tipsy, wandering, unknowingly rewriting history one wobbly step at a time. A creature that couldn't have cared less about politics, power, or profit, yet changed the map forever. Historians still debate how much impact that drunken detour really had. Was it a catalyst or a coincidence? An accident or fate? The beauty is, it doesn't really matter. The story endures, a reminder that history is messy, unpredictable, and often shaped by the smallest, most unexpected actors. And here's your final quirky tidbit: across the Silk Roads, countless tales like this circulated, about lost travelers finding new oases, about merchants outwitting bandits with clever tricks, about animals with minds of their own guiding or derailing caravans. These stories kept the roads alive in the hearts and minds of those who walked them, weaving a rich oral tradition that outlived empires and sands alike. The Silk Roads were never static. They moved, breathed, and evolved, carried forward by every traveler's step, every merchant's hope, every camel's stubborn journey. As you ride into the quiet night, stars blinking overhead like distant campfires, you feel connected to a long, winding story, a story not just of trade, but of adventure, accident, and the strange, beautiful chaos of human history. The road stretches endlessly ahead, uncertain and inviting. And you, a small thread in the vast tapestry, follow it with steady heart and open eyes. Word count, 1099. Now, slow your breath, soften your thoughts. Imagine the desert night settling around you like a warm blanket, the hum of distant caravans fading into peaceful silence. Let your worries drift away on the cool night breeze, the stars watching gently overhead. The road, the camels, the stories, they will wait. For now, rest. Sweet dreams.